So do we have visitors from Poland?
No, there's nobody booked on from Poland.
So we have Ray Sabalin from Philippines. Thank you. Is there anyone else international?
Yes.
Okay, from Sri Lanka. Lovely. Thank you very much. Delighted you could join us. Uganda. That's wonderful. And anyone else? No, okay, and I'm guessing a lot of people from UK, Ireland, and Wales. So lovely. So delighted you could join us wherever you are in the world. And obviously, as a global organisation, QSI welcome you to this CPD. So today's speaker is one of our global board members, Keith Blizzard. And very much looking forward to hearing his presentation. As you know, Keith will give you a little introduction, some of the work he's involved in, but we look forward to hearing your CPD. So Keith, over to you, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Paul. Right, if I'm going to share I think I have to do this. You may have to talk me through this, Suzanne. I share my screen.
Yeah. And then click on the screen.
Content only. Oh, click on screen. Yep.
Yep. And then go to your document.
And then do slideshow.
Yeah.
From the beginning.
Yes.
Can you see the slide?
We can. Perfect.
Excellent. Right. Good morning, everybody. Obviously, this talk is about a case in the English courts, the Technology and Construction Court. Just to give you a little bit of background, my primary profession is I'm a chartered quantity surveyor. I'm also a chartered construction manager and chartered arbitrator. And nowadays, I'm a director of Blizzard's Consulting Limited. And most of my work, most of my time is spent sitting as arbitrator and as a construction adjudicator. In terms of adjudication, I think I've been an adjudicator since the Construction Act came in, which was for the Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act, 1996, and it was came into effect and applied to any contract entered into on or after the 1st of May 1998. So that's when adjudication began. Various nominating bodies set up panels of adjudicators. I was an adjudicator on the original panels, and so I've been adjudicating ever since. And I've done between 500 and 600 decisions over that time. Now, in 2009, they had a review of the Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act, and they brought in the Local Democracy, Economic Development and Construction Act. And that applied to contracts entered into on or after the 1st of October 2011. What that act did, it changed the payment mechanism. And the payment mechanism under construction contracts was the obligation of the paying party was to pay the notified sum. And this was a creation under the LDDC. It hadn't been in before, but it was just the notified sum. Now, that means it's been in use since the 1st of October 2011. So it's been in use for over 14 years. Now, speaking to the RICS, which is the nominating body, which I think still nominates more adjudicators than anyone else, they said the majority of adjudications are still over the validity of payment notices. They're colloquially known as smash and grab. Basically, I'm not going to go through the whole payment mechanism, but basically what it comes down to is that there are payment notices and there's strict regime under the Act and therefore in every construction contract as to what payment notices have to be given. by the applicant or by the paying party, and when they have to be given. Now, the whole purpose of the original purpose of the Construction Act was to improve payments and cash flow within the construction industry. So these notices became very important. And what's happened is with these smash and grabs, if people got the notices wrong in terms of the content or the timing of them, then the notices created the notified sum. And then the well-known one really is the pay less notice. And the employer under a contract, or the paying party, if it's a main contract and subcontract, what they can do is they can issue a pay less notice. And again, the content has to be valid, and the timing has to be correct. And this is what people are still getting wrong. And there have been lots of cases in the courts of enforcement of adjudicators' decisions and looking at these notices to see whether they're valid or not. Now, in advance at ENISCA, back in 2022, there was Mrs. Justice Joanna Smith went through and she gave a review of the case law regarding the validity of notices, because you can send a notice, but whether or not it's valid is a separate question. Now then, it's that case that I'm going to talk about. Keating Chambers summarised the judgment of Mrs. Joanna Smith in this case as follows. The court dismissed a Part 8 claim. Don't worry about what a Part 8 claim is. It just means that it's the basis of the claim, the action in court, seeking a declaration regarding the validity of a pay less notice. Sorry. So I'm trying to... So I've got a little box which is hiding part of my screen. Stop sharing, that's not it. No, okay.
What can't you see, Keith?
It's right, it's the words on the right-hand side. It's all right, I've got a printout so I can look at it. The court dismissed a Part 8 claim seeking a declaration regarding the validity of a pay less notice, finding the one that had been served related to a later later application for payment. Consequently, the sum applied for became the notified sum under Section 111 of the Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act. Even though the LDEDC amended the HGCRA, then the courts and people still refer to the HGCRA as amended. So although she refers to the HGCRA, she actually means it as amended by the LDEDC. Smith J held that the pay less notices must be referable to a particular payment notice and or payment application and must relate to a particular payment cycle. The judgment once again highlights that the only way to avoid a smash and grab adjudication, that's one of these where you've got your notices wrong, and a payment liability in circumstances where one might not otherwise exist, the pay less notice showed no overpayment to ENISCA, is to ensure that valid payment and pay less notices are served. Now then, that's what this is going to be my talk is about. Now, in that judgment, at paragraph 46, this is Justice Joanna Smith, the judge, I'll call her because it's quicker, said this: I was taken during the hearing to a number of authorities in the context of the proper approach to be taken by the court to the interpretation of contractual notices. So this is generally. And she went through, including Manai Investment and Eagle Star, Thomas Vale and Brookside, Henya Investments and Beck Interiors, Jawabi, Surrey and Sussex Healthcare versus Logan Construction, and Grove Developments, S&T, and S&T versus Grove Developments, in which the Court of Appeal upheld the reasoning of the judge on this issue. When I say 57, it's paragraph 57. There is no need to set these out at length, thank goodness. The principles that they establish and which I must apply in this case are uncontroversial. So what she's done is it's very carefully and very helpfully, she's reviewed all the previous important legislation regarding the proper approach to be taken by the court to the interpretation of contractual notices. Now then, in paragraph 47, She said, in summary, the approach to be taken by the court as gleaned from these authorities is as follows. She then set out 9 paragraphs describing separate considerations which the court and therefore an arbitrator, a construction adjudicator, or anyone sending or receiving a notice should consider, it should apply when considering the validity, and I've highlighted the term validity there, of a notice, because I've done obviously a lot of these disputes. I've decided them as an adjudicator, going through, look at these notices, and they say, well, we sent a pay less notice. Yes, it's not whether or not you sent a pay less notice, it's whether or not the notice was valid. And that is the difference. Sending a notice is one thing, but is that notice that you sent a valid notice? That is the major question. And that's where people fall down. They miscalculate time. They don't include the information that's required. Anyway, in paragraph 47, she then went on to say, I shall now set each of the 9 paragraphs. And what I'm going to do in this talk is simply go through the 9. If somebody's got a question, then please, I'm happy for you to unmute yourself and ask a question while I'm going through. Paragraph 47(1). In considering the true construction of a contractual notice, including notices under the payment regime of the Act, and that's, she refers to SEGRO developments, and those are the paragraphs, and S&T. So Rupert Jackson, the question is not how its recipient in fact understood it. So it's not what the party receiving it understood. Instead, the construction of the notices must be approached objectively. The issue is how a reasonable recipient would have understood the notices, i.e., a reasonable recipient circumstanced in the actual party, as the actual parties were at the time. So what does that mean? It means that you don't have to say, well, they would have understood it, or there's a defense in, I understood it to be something else. What this paragraph is, and some of these paragraphs, these 9, do appear to sort of some overlap and perhaps even contradict each other, but as I say, hopefully I'll clarify them as I go through them. The issue is how a reasonable recipient would have understood the notices, circumstance as the actual parties were. I'm going to look at this from my point of view as an adjudicator, so that if you're sending a notice, this will give you some guidance, but also not only on what the courts have decided, but also on how someone like me will look at the notice. So when I'm looking at it, because it says it must be approached objectively, as an independent party, an independent person, I can look at it, but I have to look at it circumstance as the actual parties were. So I have to take into account the background circumstances as they were, that the parties were in at the time that the notice was sent, and importantly, the notice was received. The notice must be construed taking into account the relevant objective contextual scene, i.e., the court, therefore, as adjudicator, I must consider what meanings the language read against the contextual scene. What meanings the language read against the contextual scene will let in. This means that, amongst other things, the reasonable recipient will be credited with knowledge of the relevant contract. Now, that's important because in the contract, there are certain requirements in the Act, but construction contracts sometimes go even further. And so you have to look at what the terms of the contract were when you're considering the validity of a notice. So what is actually being said? What's set out? What's described? Because if you think of contractual analysis, what you do is you analyze the words that are used, and therefore what meanings the language would normally have, but in the context of the particular contract and the circumstances in which a notice was sent. The purpose of the notice will be relevant to its construction and validity. And then the manner, all that she's done here is, all the judge has done here is referred to, referenced where she's got that idea from, and therefore where you've got, and the reference there. So it's Manai at 768E, that's the paragraph number. That's what it's for. So you can always go and look each of these up in the original case, if you've got this case to hand, or these notes to hand. So the purpose of the notice will be relevant to its construction and validity. Well, what was the sender actually trying to do? Was it an application for payment? Did they ask for payment? When they sent the pay less notice, was it clearly meant to be a pay less notice? There was a case where there were negotiations, discussion after practical completion, and they were sending things, information to and fro. And the contractor sent our latest draft final account, and they sent it to the employer's team, the QS and the contract administrator. But they didn't actually say they wanted payment. And when they started an adjudication, in fact, it went to court, the Manai case, basically the courts turned around and said, well, actually, this was just a copy of your latest calculation of the final account. You didn't actually ask for a payment. It's not clear on the face of it that it was an application for a payment. You were just sending information, and therefore it wasn't a valid payment application, therefore not a valid notice. And because of that, you weren't asking for a payment. It wasn't therefore a valid application for a payment, and therefore it didn't create a notified sum. And it's this notified sum which we'll probably keep coming back to. Right, the court will be, number 4, the court will be unimpressed by nice points of contextual analysis or arguments which seek to condemn the notice on an artificial or contrived basis. And that was by Her Honour Judge Kirkham in the Thomas Vale case. Instead, as Sir Peter Coulson, who's now an appeal court judge, but he wrote his book before he became an appeal court judge on construction adjudication, says, the courts will take a common sense, practical view of the contents of a pay less notice and will not adopt an unnecessarily restrictive interpretation of such a notice. It is thought that, provided that the notice makes tolerably clear what is being held and why, the court will not strive to intervene or endeavour to find reasons that would render such a notice invalid or ineffective. But what does that mean? When I'm looking or considering submissions, there are very few ways of avoiding a smash and grab. But what I find is defending it, either attacking a notice or defending it, then party representatives sometimes say, well, actually, if you take the meaning of each individual word, and it could be interpreted this way, it could be interpreted that way. There's no comma in it because lawyers don't like commas, and therefore it could be read this way, and I think could be read the other way. And what they're saying is that the courts will be unimpressed by detailed contextual analysis or arguments which seek to condemn the notice on an artificial or contrived basis. In other words, if you know you're going to lose, what you might try and do is describe a weird interpretation or a convoluted interpretation of the words actually used on the payment notice, although focusing specifically on pay less notices. And it just says the courts, and therefore I as adjudicator or arbitrator, will take a common sense, practical view of the contents of a pay less notice. And here I go back to the previous provisions and the previous paragraphs, where you're asked to look at it in the context of the circumstances and the terms of the contract at the time. So quite often you get I get a series, an email chain, because people love using email chains because it's quicker than writing individual emails. So you may get a 7-page chain of emails, and in fact sometimes that can be very helpful because you can go through those and see and understand what the parties were saying. Personally, particularly as an adjudicator and arbitrator, I always send individual emails. I never, unless I'm out somewhere and I've got to reply something quickly and I have to do it on my phone, I might do a reply all. But generally, I write individual emails, and I advise clients to do that as well. Write individual emails, and there you don't get a chain then. But when you do get a chain, you can see what were they talking about. Were they talking about, in the case of the latest version of a final account, if the chain below is saying, well, I've got up to this figure, and what's your latest? You've got more information. What's your latest calculation of the anticipated final account? And they write back saying, oh well, our latest calculation is this much. Clearly, in the context of the circumstances and looking at the other emails, it wasn't an application for payment. If you do a separate one and highlight it and head it up, application for payment, it makes it very much clearer. And I've seen emails where parties have said, well, what they tried to do is they sent us this information and now they're saying it's an application. It wasn't an application. That's why we didn't send a pay less notice, and we didn't deal with it because we didn't realize from that, and it's not clear from that it was an application for payment. So here, though, what they're saying is the courts will take a common sense, practical view of the contents of a pay less notice and will not adopt an unnecessarily restrictive interpretation of such a notice. So again, it's coming back to this looking at it looking the notice in context. Is it clear what it's supposed to be? Number 5. There is no principal reason for adopting a different approach to construction in respect of different kinds of payment notices. For example, sorry, I have to refer to mine. Because some may give rise to more draconian consequences than others, and that would be contrary to the guidance in Manite. Now, there's an interesting, because the reason they've used the term draconian was because in another case, which is another one of these paragraphs refers to it, the judge in that case said that a pay less notice has to be very clear and various other things which we'll come on to, because the draconian, and what they wanted to do was not have an overly prescriptive interpretation of the notice, because the consequences are very draconian. If you get a pay less notice wrong, you've got to pay the notified sum which was created by the previous notice. So when you've got through the payment cycle, an application in certain circumstances, depending on the terms of the contract, may well create a notified sum. Then you get a payment notice from the payer that may amend the notified sum. If that gets missed, the original application may, depending on the terms of the contract, become the notified sum. Then you get through to a pay less notice. And if you get the pay less notice wrong, you've got to go back to the original notified sum. And that's what smash and grabs are basically about. So the particularly adverse consequences for an employer that follow from, say, a contractor's unanswered application of payment notice are relevant to the test of the reasonable recipient. Because there's such adverse consequences of getting a pay less notice wrong, then that should also be relevant to the test of the reasonable recipient. Number 6, to qualify as a valid notice, any payment notice must comply with the statutory, and if more restrictive, the contractual requirements in substance and form. Payment notices and pay less notices must clearly set out the sum which is due and or to be deducted and the basis on which the sum is calculated. Beyond that, the question of whether a notice is or is not valid is a question of fact and degree. That's lovely, because that's a big scramble clause. So to qualify for a notice, any payment notice must comply with a statutory. There are statutory requirements, which is basically a payment notice must, whoever it's sent by, whether it's the payee that puts making the application or the payer who's going to actually pay the money, the statutory requirements are that it must be the amount that's truly believed by the person sending the notice to be the amount that's due for payment. And it must show how that sum is calculated. And there was a case whereby they realized that they were a payment, they had to send a payment notice, an application had been made, and under the terms of the contract, it created a notified sum for payment. They didn't have time to do it, so what the contract administrator did was he sent a payment notice and said, right, we owe you £1. We'll send another notice when we've worked out exactly how much we're going to pay. Now, because the statutory requirement that it has to be the amount that you believe to be paid, that sending £1 notice in time and then sending an amended notice later, when they sent the £1 notice in time, it wasn't the sum that they actually believed was to be due, because they'd admitted in the covering email, in the context of the situation, they'd admitted that when they worked out the actual amount, they'll send another notice. And therefore, the original notice just saying we're going to pay you £1 was not a valid notice because it didn't comply with the statutory requirements. Now, sometimes the contract can have not contradictory terms. They can't contradict the requirements of the statutory notice, the statutory requirements for a notice, but it can have further things included. So you have to look at the contractual requirements. And this is what I have to do, or adjudicators have to do. We have to look at the contractual requirements are in a payment cycle. In other words, payment number 27 or payment number 28 to payment 29, they're all individual cycles. And for that payment cycle, what I do is I go to the contract and I write out, I know it's in November 2025. So I work out from the contract, in November 2025, what's the date when the contractor should have made an application? Does the contract say it can make an application? If it does, I make a note of that. I'm not looking at the submissions. I'm not looking at what they actually did. I'm simply looking at the contract. And I write out the mechanism. They should have applied. The contractor may make an application no later than the 14th of November, 2 weeks before the notice date, the due date. Then what happens then is, when is the due date? And then when should a payment notice have been given? And I've got a date. And then I look at what's the final date for payment. I can calculate that. And then I work backwards to what's the last date of a payment notice, a pay less notice could be given. I then got that written down. I can then look at the documents and say, right, was the timing right for those? And I've done that, and on a number of occasions, I've then said, well, the application was late, so therefore it wasn't a valid application. And I actually had one where the application was late, the payment notice was late, and the pay less notice was late. And therefore, there was no notified sum created at all, because none of the notices were valid. They'd all been sent, but none of them were valid. So there was no notified sum created by that paperwork. You then go into another mechanism. But that's what I have to do. And so someone sending a notice must do the same thing. It's very simple. It doesn't take long just to write it out. And if you're the QS or the contract administrator, or the contractor, it's very simple to the QS for the contractor's QS. It's very simple just to go through exactly what I do and write them out. Then you look at the statutory requirements. Okay, all the notices are in or out of time. If they're in time, do they make it plain on the face of it? Are they actually making an application for payment? Yes, it says the email is headed application for payment, or it's not headed application for payment. Does the notice actually make it clear that it is a payment notice or a pay less notice? Because there's the three. There's application, payment notice, pay less notice. Does it make it clear? Is the attachment headed? Is it the right payment cycle? Because the earlier case I talked about, if the pay less notice, it has to be relevant to the actual payment cycle. And in fact, if you're interested in case law, there was an adjudication which I did, which was Bell Build versus T. Clark. And there was it was a smash and grab. So it was very few people like the term smash and grab, because it gives the wrong connotation to what the contractor's doing. He's put in his genuinely believed application for payment, and then the paperwork's wrong. But anyway, in that case, it was one of these technical payment notice adjudications. And the claimant said, right, we made an application for payment, and they then sent a payment notice. They then paid us an amount of money, which was less than the amount that we were actually applying for. The pay less notice wasn't valid. And then, so it went back to the amount they'd applied for. That was the basis of the adjudication. The notices weren't valid. So the application created the notified sum which should have been paid, which I found, I agree with them, it did. They made a payment, and then they received a second payment, which still was less than the total amount they'd applied for. So what they did was, the contractor wrote and said, this second payment, we've just received this payment, is it against payment cycle? I can't remember which number it was now, it doesn't matter. 18, I think it was 18, I think. Was that a second payment against number 18? Because you're still short, you still owe us the balance, or not? And the other side didn't reply, they didn't answer. So in their submissions in the adjudication, they said, right, their payment pay less notice is not valid for these reasons, as I say, with which I agreed. Our payment application created a notified sum. They've paid, I'll give you some figures. Let's say, these aren't the figures, but let's say they wanted a payment of £100,000. They received a payment of £50,000, and then they received another payment of £25,000. They'd asked them what the second payment of £25,000 related to. Was it part of the £100,000 that they actually owed? And they never got an answer. So in the adjudication, I had to work out the amount of the payment. So I wrote to the parties and I said to the respondent, what is the purpose of the second payment? And the solicitors representing the respondent wrote me a very indignant email saying that the second payment related to application number 19. And as I was only concerned with application 18, I could not consider it. Well, as QSs, you'll realise straight away what the problem there is, that as soon as I couldn't consider that, then I knew the only payment was the first payment, the £50,000. So the claimant in the adjudication had said, I don't want to overclaim, or we don't want to overclaim, so we're assuming that the 25,000 was against application number 18. When the respondent wrote back and said, no, I couldn't consider it, I couldn't. So regarding application 18, they'd applied for 100,000, they'd been paid 50 in the adjudication because of this 25,000 payment, which they'd taken into account, which I couldn't. They hadn't been paid that 25,000. So the outstanding balance was £50,000. So they'd applied for 100, they'd only had paid 50. So I said they had to pay 50,000. The actual figures in the adjudication, the claimant claimed 1.4 million, and the second payment was 700,000. So having applied for 1.4 million, I decided that the respondents actually had to pay, in relation to number 18, application number 18, 2.1 million. And I think you can imagine the disappointment, apparently, in the office of the solicitors who are representing the respondent when they got my decision. In fact, it went to court, and they refused. They tried to. The claimant took it to court to enforce the decision for the £2.1 million payment, and they said no, Blizzard's gone off on his own. He's done valuation, all the rest of it. It was a fairly hopeless case, and the judge very quickly summarised it and said, he asked you what the payment was for. You told him he couldn't. They'd taken it into account. So, in fact, when you told the adjudicator he couldn't, automatically the payment due to the claimant under application 18 must increase, because he wasn't allowed to take into account the payment. So, therefore, and the decision was obviously enforced. So, payment notice of payment must clearly set out the sum which is due. Sorry, but I've got a question. Yeah.
Yes, there are actually some questions popped into the chat. Do you want to take them now?
Or... I can do, because I can't see the chat, because I've just got the full screen here.
Okay, well, I'll read them out to you, and you can either answer them or say we'll leave them till the end. So the first one is simply, what if the application is early?
Oh, right. There was an interesting case. It's Leeds versus Waco, where I was the adjudicator. And a few years ago, the JCT contracts, post-practical completion, they introduced this interim valuations continued until the final account sorted out. And you had an application you had an interim valuation every other month, every 2 months. And Waco made an application post practical completion, and they made the application in the middle month. In other words, it wasn't March or May, they made it in March, April. So it was I think it was September actually, but anyway, they made it in the middle month. And the argument was, the respondent said it wasn't a valid notice because it was too early, because it was a month early. The claimant said, no, the contract says no later than 2 weeks before the due date. Well, the fact that it's 4 weeks before the due date means it's 6 weeks before the due date means it's still a valid, because it's before the due date. And I thought, well, on the interpretation of the contract, reading what the contract says, I agree. And the judge, when they went for the Leeds City Council didn't pay, so Waco went to enforce it, and the judge said, this is quite complicated. I need a full trial. I can't just do it on sort of on the hoof in summary, what's called summary judgment. But then he said, but what's got to happen is, because of this idea of cash flow and the purpose of adjudication, Leeds City Council, you have to pay Waco the amount of money that I decided, which I think was about 300,000. It was a big sum of money. So you had to pay that before you could start the court case, and I'll hear the court case, and have a full trial over the validity of the notice. So Leeds actually paid the money, and then Leeds started the case, which is why it's Leeds versus Waco, not Waco chasing the money against Leeds. So Leeds then started the case to get back the amount of money, because they said it wasn't a valid notice. And that's when the court suddenly created this, oh, yes, it was too early. So you can be too early. And there have been various cases. Well, how early is too early? And basically, I think where we are at the moment, it's about 5 days. Hopefully that answers that question. Yep.
Yeah, okay. The next one says, if a payment notice is not issued in time against an application for payment, does the application then automatically become the notified sum? E.g., then an invoice could be issued to match the application? Or is it the responsibility of the applicant to respond and confirm to say they consider that the application is now the notified sum?
No, read the contract. You don't have to confirm you don't have to confirm it, but don't forget you can't issue your invoice until the final date for a pay less notice has passed, because there is still the payer has the opportunity to issue the payment notice, but if they fail to make a payment notice, then they can still issue, the payer can still issue a pay less notice, and that would change the notified sum. And I have had it in one adjudication not long ago, where the contract administrator never issued payment notices. The contractor issued its application, and all they ever did was they got the employer to give a pay less notice. So they missed out one part of the cycle, but they had to wait to the end of the pay less notice. If there's no pay less notice or no valid pay less notice is issued, once that date is passed, or it's issued but it's not a valid pay less notice, issue your invoice. But the courts have also said you cannot make payment dependent on a VAT invoice. The payment is due because of the notice and the notices, and the notified sum has to be paid. So even if you don't send an invoice, you should. Now, obviously, from both parties' accounting purposes, if you're charging VAT, whether it's zero rated or not, then what you do is you do actually issue an invoice. Whether an application automatically, it depends on the terms of the contract, because what the statute says is that if a contract provides, and the statute doesn't, it just says if the contract provides that the payee can make an application, then if there's they don't issue a valid payment notice, then that does create the notified sum. If the contract doesn't provide you can make an application, then the way it works is as soon as the payment notice should have been issued and wasn't, in other words, the day after, then you can make an application, and that then creates the notified sum. I think that answers that one.
Thank you, Keith. I have two more.
Good.
Do you know why the payment rules on the JCT D&B contracts are different from the other forms? i.e. in that when there is no application in time, there is no obligation for the payee to issue a notice, etc. On the other forms, the payee still has to process the notice, even if the application isn't received 7 days before the due date. And then he says, oh, have I got it wrong?
Well, the statute says you've got a payment cycle, so you have to issue notices. If you don't issue a notice, then as soon as the notice isn't issued, you can actually issue your payment notice. But no, that's not my understanding of the JCT contract, to be honest, because you've got to issue payment notices. The fact that they haven't made an application still means there's a payment cycle.
Yeah, just to come in on that, Keith, because I've had this on a project where a contractor actually went into liquidation, and I think a QS then tried to do a payment note, or the employer's agent, and the clients looked into it and they said, no, if you haven't actually submitted anything, there is no process. Well, you and I have a look at this separately, I think, because it fascinated me, because I looked into all the other JCT contracts, and it then says if there's no application, the contract administrator will deal with something. If he then doesn't, the contractor can put his application in, but the D&B just goes silent. It just doesn't say anything like that. I'll have a look at it again, and I'll come back to you offline, because it's fascinating why it doesn't have the same arrangements.
Yes, I'll be interested to see that. Is that which version is that? Is that the 2024 contract or the 2016?
Yeah, 2016. I've double checked the 24 as well.
And it's the same.
Yeah, it's the same.
All right, we'll have a look at that.
It just doesn't have those extra paragraphs that where there isn't an application, and it really. It was. I learned from a client. You know how sometimes we get caught out with these things. He said to his solicitor, "What's going on here?" And they said, "No, he didn't put one in. You don't do anything." But I say you are the expert, and I'll come to you separately on this, and we'll have a chat.
You introduced the additional magic words in liquidation, because then no more. Right, as when a company goes into liquidation, then the JCTs say, including the D&B, that then you don't have to make no further sums become due.
Yes.
Right? And any sums that were due before the liquidation don't have to be paid. So I think that's why they probably said it. I'm very happy to, if you contact me direct through email, then yes, we'll have a look at it. And I'm quite happy to give me your phone number. I'm quite happy to have a discussion about it. But the thing there is liquidation.
Yeah, I get. Yeah,
in liquidation, once they go into liquidation, then the whole payment mechanism then changes.
Yeah, no, that's true. I'll double check my facts and I'll come to you directly and we can have a chat about it. Thanks.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. But that's why I think the solicitor, because my advice would have been the same thing. They haven't made an application. You don't have to do it. Because they've gone into liquidation, no further sums become due. So you don't have to issue a payment notice because they've already gone into liquidation. But anyway, yes, we'll debate that. That'll be fine. What was the last question then?
Yeah, thank you. That sounds an interesting one. Oh, actually, just before we go to that, something has just been put into the chat relating to the D&B form. 4.7.5, the employer shall give a notice, brackets payment notice, to the contractor at the due date and the basis on which that sum has been calculated. But maybe the liquidation thing overrules that.
That's why I said originally my understanding of the JCT contract was even if you didn't, that's the clause. So I don't have the contract open in front of me.
No, it's fine.
But the liquidation, as I just explained, that changes everything because there's no further sums become due, so you don't need to issue a notice.
Okay, so let's move on to the last question I have here, which is, can a smash and grab be overruled in the next payment cycle, in the sense that the account is not final until final account certified, so an amount can be revalued in upcoming valuations or final valuation?
This is a very interesting question because I've had to deal with this as an adjudicator, where what they've done is they've gone back and said, oh, application number 3, they didn't pay us. And what the courts have said is that, yes, each payment cycle is its own. So what you can do is you can go back to a previous application, get paid that sum, and then hope that the subsequent applications, because if it was a long time ago and it wasn't paid, then that the subsequent applications and payments will cover that. So in the next payment cycle after the adjudication, you can rectify that. But yes, it's a bit of an open question at the moment, because what's happened is that the judgment of the courts, and therefore case law, which binds us, they make decisions on certain things, like in the Leeds and Waco. Until then, nobody knew that you could have a payment notice that was too early, an application that was too early. The courts created that because it was so early. That's what the judge decided. A judge decided that each payment notice, each payment cycle was independent, and you could have a true value and a a smash and grab, to use the colloquialism, a payment notice dispute. But then if that went against you, you could then go back and have a true value. You had to pay the amount of money that was due under the adjudication for the smash and grab. But then once you've paid it, you could then go back and do a true value over the same payment cycle. So that's what you could do. If it was one was long time ago, you could either do it over, sort it out and you have to pay more money because at number 2 or number 3, you didn't pay the full amount. Then if at the next time you do a valuation in the next payment cycle, if it's still a live job, and there are monthly valuations, which of course nowadays under the JCT include the time during the rectification period. In the next valuation, then when you deduct the amount paid to date, it'll be a higher figure. So that takes it into account. And in fact, it's also true it's supported by the Bell and T. Clark case, because as they said, I couldn't take into account the payment under payment 19, but they'd already paid that sum. So under 18, they had to pay the 2.1 million. And the judge enforced that as well. So this is what it comes down to. You can go back and do previous adjudications, And then there's two ways of sorting it out. If you lose in that, go back to application number 2. You didn't pay the full amount. Pay the balance now, and then you can go back and do a true value and get that money back. Or alternatively, it's just easier if it's a live job to go to the next interim payment, the next payment cycle from now, from the time of getting the adjudicator's decision, and just turn around and say, well, okay, the amount paid to date includes the additional amount I had to go back and pay for number 2. Okay. Does that clear the questions? As I say, I can't see them.
Yeah, there's a comment just come in that's, well, in fact, there's 2 now. We've started a bit of discussion here. We recently had a smash and grab against us for an application for payment 2, as there wasn't a valid PN, payment notice, issued, but we had subsequently issued valid PN 3 and 4, but this wasn't taken into account, and we've had to pay AFP 2. Does that make sense?
That's exactly what I said. I just happened to pick going back to number 2 as a guess. But anyway, just as a sample number. But that's right. That just confirms what I've just said. The fact that you can go back and do previous ones and you have to pay it.
Okay. And then the final comment is, one note on the notice in default: the Act requires the application to meet the requirements of the Act in terms of content. Otherwise, it requires a valid notice in default to be issued after the date the payment notice was due.
Yes, a default payment notice still the application. The default payment notice is an application, but you have to call it default payment notice to make it clear what it is. But yes, it still has to meet the requirements of the showing the amount that you're claiming, the money. You have to show that how it's calculated, and it has to be what the applicant believes to be the sum that should be paid. So yes, that's clear.
Okay. And something else has just popped in. If the contractor doesn't submit an application, then can the employer issue a payment notice of 0 to protect them commercially?
Well, what's the difference between 0 and £1? The answer is, if they don't make an application, you still, in each payment cycle, subject to the terms of the contract, but what the statute says is you still have to go through, as we've just debated over the design and build. It's still a payment cycle. The onus is on the payer to value the works and say how much they're going to pay, because the contracts generally, and I say I don't have any of them open in front of me, but generally what they say is the contractor, sometimes I think the D&B says shall, but contracts generally, in my experience, say the contractor may make an application. So it doesn't have to, but if they don't, then it's still the burden is still on the paying party to value the works. You can't get away with it and just say, oh, you didn't make an application, so I'm not going to pay you anything. So no, if the 0 is not the sum that you believe to be correct, then no, it's not a valid. It's going back to what I said before about the people who issued £1. If it's not an accurate reflection of what you believe to be true, the true value of the works, then no, it's not a valid notice.
Okay, thank you, Keith. That's it. Back to you.
Right, great. Thank you very much. So I think I've covered this one actually. Payment notices, payless notice must clearly set out the sum which is due and or to be deducted, and the basis on which the sum is calculated. Beyond that, the question of whether a notice is or is not valid notice is a question of fact and degree. In other words, you've got leeway there. Well, in the circumstances, was it clearly an application? Was it clearly a payment notice? Was it clearly a payless notice? Number 7. Over and above the question of whether the notice has achieved the required degree of specificity. Yes, specificity. Information. The required degree of specificity will be the additional question of whether the document that is alleged to constitute a valid notice was in fact intended to be such, and whether it is free from ambiguity. The sender's intention is a matter to be assessed objectively, taking into account the content. And that's going back to the example I gave earlier, really, which was that when they sent the final, our latest version of our final account is this, it wasn't clear, and it has to be free from ambiguity. If you're sending an application for payment, say it, whether at the covering email or on the top of the document, application for payment number 2113 or whatever. If you make it clear, payment notice in relation to application dated or due date dated, so identify it, and pay less notice in relation to payment cycle number 26. That's what you've got to do. Make it clear. 8. Although in Grove, Coulson J observed that payment notices must make plain what they are, there is no requirement for a particular type of notice, such as pay less notice, to have that title or to make specific reference to the contractual clause in order to be valid. The question is whether, viewed objectively, it had the requisite intention to fulfill that function. If you are sending a notice, the easiest thing to do is to avoid confusion or ambiguity. Say on the top somewhere what it is. And withholding notices finished over 14 years ago with the LDEDC. That created pay less notices. Before that, it was withholding notices. And I still see in adjudications contract administrators and QSs who had their notice withholding notice. It's a pay less notice. We have those for 14 years. You're either using old stationery, but just try and get real with the current situation. It's a pay less notice. What they're saying is you don't actually have to label it a pay less notice, but it makes life so much easier if you do. The question is whether, viewed objectively, it had the requisite intention to fulfill that function. Right. And finally, number 9. One way of testing the validity or otherwise of a pay less notice will be to see whether it provided an adequate agenda for an adjudication. And this is quite an interesting one, actually. What does that actually mean? Well, it means sorry, I didn't read the whole thing. One way of testing the validity or otherwise of a pay less notice will be to see whether it provided an adequate agenda for an adjudication as to the true value of the works. In other words, is the pay less notice sufficiently informative that they set out what they truly what the sum that they were going to pay and the amount that it how that sum was calculated? Because if it provided an adequate agenda for an adjudication as to the true value of the works, which it should do, because it should include it's not a valid note. In order to be a valid pay less notice, it has to say the sum it's paid. Just writing and saying we're not going to pay you anything, that's not saying how the sum is calculated, and it has to be how that sum is calculated at the time of the notice being sent. So for that, you have to say how the sum is calculated, the base on which it's calculated. Now, if you do, does the notice provide an adequate agenda for an adjudication as to the true value of the works? In other words, is there sufficient information they can go through and say, you value the substructures at 1.1 million, we valued it at 1.5 million. Is that sufficient? If it's sufficient, then you can say it was a valid pay less notice if it was in time. But if not, you can't. Right, that's my well, it's just like we're almost out of time. Thank you for your attention. I hope you have found and will continue to find this helpful. I've given a PDF of the slides to Suzanne. So I think anyone who wants copies of the slides, then if you let Suzanne know, she will give you a copy of those slides. I shall now stop sharing.
Thank you, Keith. Okay, so in the chat, we do have another one here, which I think probably relates back to paragraph 6 again, which is, if the application is late, does the payer simply value the works?
He's obliged to do it anyway, yes, with the amount, that they consider, not believe, but they consider to be due.
Okay. Yeah. And there's a comment really that says one area that needs to be considered is that the sample rules apply to a consultant's appointment.
Okay.
Okay. Colin, do you want to comment on that?
Sorry, it was my type in there. The same rules apply.
Same.
Oh,
Thank
right.
you.
Okay. Yes, it is,
Yeah,
because
consultants think that they're not subject to the same statutory requirements in their appointment. So if your client doesn't pay, I'm assuming that when you issue an invoice, etc., you're working on the same principles.
absolutely, because what the Act says when it was introduced, because it's payment, and they said it includes surveying services and architecture and various things. So professional, I see this all the time. You know, architects and professionals contact me and say, look, we haven't been paid. You know, I'm owed this money. Go to adjudication then. Did they give you a pay less notice? No, they didn't give me any notice. But you then have to look at what the application said. It's the amount, how it's the amount that's due, believed to be due, and the basis on which it's calculated. So you do have to, but yes, the same rules apply for architects, structural engineers, and QSs actually, when you're claiming your fees.
We are actually just over 9 o'clock now, but there's just one more there in the chat, which, sorry, somebody just put another message in and it's moved it off the top of my screen. Here we go. How would an adjudicator consider the common valuation paid on account, in inverted commas?
Well, you've got to look at the context and see what do they actually mean by paid on account. I think that if that was put in a notice, I would be, as an adjudicator, I'd be looking at, well, does that mean that is the amount they're going to pay because it's just interim valuation number, whatever, and it's paid on account? Or are they looking at it? It depends. If it's in the build-up, you sometimes may say, right, well, variation number 26. You valued it at I don't know, £1,000. Well, I don't think it's that much. So on the moment, until I get more information, it's a payment on account of £500. That's okay. If it's the whole application or the whole payment notice is a payment on account, I'd be concerned about whether or not that's a valid notice.
Thank you, Keith. I think that's all. So thank you ever so much for a very interesting presentation there. You clearly stirred a lot of debate and discussion and a lot of questions. So thank you. It's much appreciated. Thank you everyone for attending. As Keith says, happy to share his slides with you. If you pop a note in the chat now or send me an email at any time, that's absolutely fine. Same goes for anyone requiring a CPD certificate in the chat or on the email, and I'll sort that out for you. We obviously have our next First Thursday Club on the 5th of March, so looking forward to seeing a lot of you there. We have a gentleman from Nomitech who will be speaking to us, I believe, on Costex. So that should be another interesting session, but details will come out on the email probably early next week, I should imagine. So thank you all again, and a huge thank you to Keith for a really interesting talk there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to receiving the email at the debate about the design and build contract.
From Jim, yes.
Thanks very much. Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Goodbye.
Cheers, well done.